The silence was the first thing that hit. Not a quiet moment between conversations, but a heavy, physical silence. The kind that sucks the air out of a room and makes your ears ring. 150 people, doctors, nurses, administrators, and the anxious corporate executives from the parent company, had been crammed into the waiting room of the Hopewell Community Clinic. Their collective anxiety, a low, buzzing hum. Now, that hum was gone, replaced by a stillness so profound you could hear the frantic beating of 150 hearts. It started with the cars, not one, but a fleet of 4 identical, obsidian black Rolls-Royce Cullinans, vehicles so alien to this part of the city they might as well have been spaceships. They glided to the curb with an unnatural quiet, their engines purring a note of impossible wealth. The street, usually bustling with city buses and beat-up sedans, seemed to hold its breath. People on the sidewalk stopped, their phones coming out as if by instinct. Doors opened in unison, not by the occupants, but by men in dark, impeccably tailored suits and earpieces, their faces impassive, their movements economical. They secured the area with a quiet professionalism that was more intimidating than any overt show of force. Then, from the lead vehicle, a man emerged. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who understood physical labor, but he was dressed in a suit that cost more than the clinic's entire monthly payroll. It was a deep charcoal gray, a custom Tom Ford piece that fit him like a second skin. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, catching the dull afternoon light. He wasn't handsome in the way of a movie star. His features were too strong, too severe. But he radiated an aura of power so immense it was a tangible force, a gravity that bent the world around him. He walked into the Hopewell Community Clinic, his footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum floor. The corporate executive who had been delivering the clinic's death sentence, a speech full of meaningless jargon about strategic restructuring and asset reallocation, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. The room, which had been filled with quiet sobs and angry murmurs, fell into that thick, absolute silence. The man's eyes scanned the room, passing over the pale-faced executives, passing over the stunned doctors, passing over the weeping receptionists. He walked past the clinic manager, Brenda, a woman who had built her entire identity on a leased Mercedes and designer knockoffs. Her face, usually a mask of smug superiority, had collapsed into a mess of confusion and dawning horror. His gaze finally landed on a nurse standing near the back, her hands clasped in front of her worn, light blue scrubs. Amara Nwosu. Her face was a canvas of disbelief, her large, dark eyes wide with a question she couldn't dare to ask. She recognized him. Not the suit, not the cars, not the power, but the eyes, the quiet, kind eyes of the man with the wounded hand. He walked directly to her, his expensive shoes making no sound now. The world had shrunk to the space between them. He stopped a foot away, and the scent of his cologne, something clean and woody and impossibly expensive, washed over her, a stark contrast to the clinic's smell of antiseptic and quiet desperation. He looked down at her, and a small, gentle smile touched his lips, a smile she knew well. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, not for a phone, but for a small velvet box. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a vacuum. Every person held their breath, waiting. This was the moment, the breaking point, the end of one story and the beginning of another. If you love stories where the humble are exalted and the proud are brought low, where kindness is revealed to be the world's only true superpower, then hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because the payback in this story isn't just about money. It's about a justice so poetic it will restore your faith in the universe. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, Amara Nwosu's life was measured in increments of exhaustion. Her day began at 4:30 a.m. in a tiny apartment in the city's least fashionable borough. The apartment was her sanctuary and her prison. The faucet in the kitchen sink had a persistent drip, a tiny metallic metronome counting out the seconds of her life. Her window looked out onto a solid brick wall, the surface stained with years of rain and neglect. It was all she could afford. Her salary as a registered nurse at a community clinic was stretched thin, pulled in a dozen different directions like an old, frayed rope. She was 32 years old, but some mornings she felt 62. The weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her shoulders even before she got out of bed. There was the $1,200 for rent, due on the first of the month without fail. There was the $800 she wired to her mother in a small village just outside of Lagos, Nigeria, every single month. That money paid for her mother's medication, for food, and for repairs to the family home. Then there was the tuition for her younger sister, Funke, who was studying to be an engineer at the University of Ibadan. Amara was paying for that too. Every textbook, every fee, every naira came from her double shifts, her skipped lunches, her life that had been stripped down to the bare essentials of work, sleep, and worry. And then there was the debt. A sour, shameful knot in the pit of her stomach. It was $7,450, a ghost of a past relationship that haunted her bank account. His name was David. He had been a junior accountant at a downtown firm, a man who wore ambition like an ill-fitting suit. He drove a leased BMW he couldn't afford and spoke of a future full of corner offices and stock options. When he met Amara, he saw a stepping stone, a woman with good credit and a gentle nature he could easily exploit. He had belittled her quietly, with 1,000 tiny cuts. He mocked her accent, calling it thick. He wrinkled his nose at the smell of the Nigerian food she loved to cook. He criticized her job. "You're just a nurse, Amara," he'd said one night, his voice slick with condescension. "You'll always be smelling of disinfectant and desperation." The words had lodged in her heart like a shard of glass. He left her for a marketing manager with a condo and a membership at a yacht club. He also left her with the debt he'd accumulated on a credit card he'd convinced her to open in her name. No money, no apology, no place to go but deeper into the hole he had dug for her. That betrayal had broken something in her, but it had also forged something new. It forged a quiet, unshakable resilience. She had cried for a week, and then she had stopped. She picked up more shifts. She stopped buying coffee. She started mending her own clothes. She would not be broken. Her life became a blur of 16-hour days. The bus ride to the clinic in the pre-dawn dark, the feel of her worn scrubs against her skin, the constant, humming fluorescent lights of the Hopewell Community Clinic. The clinic was like her, overworked, underfunded, but still trying. It served the city's forgotten people, the uninsured, the immigrants, the elderly who lived on fixed incomes. It was a place of quiet dignity and quiet suffering, and it was ruled by Brenda. Brenda was the clinic manager, a woman who wielded her little bit of power like a weapon. She was in her late 40s, with a face that was a testament to moderately priced cosmetic procedures, a smile that was 40% real and 60% dentistry. She drove a white Mercedes C-Class, the lease payments for which were a source of constant, simmering panic that she channeled into petty tyranny. She would dock a nurse's pay for being 2 minutes late, but spend an hour on the phone with her hair salon. She scrutinized every chart, looking for errors. She rationed supplies, counting out bandages and alcohol swabs as if they were gold coins. Brenda had a special kind of disdain for Amara. She saw Amara's quiet competence not as a virtue, but as a threat. She saw her humility as weakness. Nuosu, she would bark across the nurse's station, deliberately mispronouncing her name. Did you chart Mrs. Henderson's vitals? I need it 5 minutes ago. She would make Amara redo tasks that were already perfect. She would assign her the most difficult patients, the ones who were angry or confused or in the deepest pain. Amara never complained. She just did the work. She would hold the hand of a frightened old woman. She would coax a smile from a scared child. She would clean wounds with a gentle efficiency that was a kind of art. She moved through the chaos of the clinic like a calming presence, her voice always low, her hands always steady. Her colleagues admired her. Fatima, an older nurse from Ghana who had seen it all, would often shake her head. That woman has the soul of a saint and the patience of a stone, she'd say, nodding toward Amara. Brenda tries to grind her down, but she doesn't realize Amara is the rock the whole clinic is built on. Amara's only true respite was her weekly phone call with her mother. On Sunday evenings, she would sit by her window, looking at the brick wall, and listen to her mother's voice, a lifeline stretching across 6,000 miles of ocean. Her mother, Idia, was a woman of few words and profound wisdom. She didn't understand the complexities of Amara's life in America, the crushing weight of its bills and its loneliness. But she understood the landscape of the human heart. "How are you, my daughter?" she would ask, her voice crackling over the line. "I am fine, Mama. Just tired." "Rest is for the next life," her mother would say, a familiar refrain. Then she would offer a proverb, a small, polished stone of wisdom. One week it was, "A patient dog eats the fattest bone." Another, "Smooth seas do not make skillful sailors." But the one that stuck with Amara, the one that became her mantra, was simple. She had been telling her mother about a homeless man she had given her lunch to, and how Brenda had reprimanded her for it. Her mother listened patiently, and then said, "Do not mind her, Amara. Remember what I always told you. The hand that gives, gathers. The hand that gives, gathers." Amara held on to those words. They were her shield against the bitterness that threatened to creep into her heart. She continued to give. She gave her time, her energy, her compassion. She gave the last $10 in her purse to a young mother whose child needed medicine. She gave her lunch away more times than she could count. She gave and gave, even when she had almost nothing left. She didn't know it, but her giving was a kind of prayer, and the universe was listening. The day it happened was a Tuesday, a brutally hot, soul-crushingly busy Tuesday in late July. The clinic's air conditioning was failing, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat and anxiety. The waiting room was overflowing. Every chair was taken, and people were leaning against the walls, fanning themselves with pamphlets. Brenda was in a particularly foul mood, her voice sharp and brittle as she barked orders. Amara was running on 4 hours of sleep and a cup of instant coffee. She had just finished dressing a burn on a construction worker's arm and was updating his chart when the man walked in. He didn't look like anyone special. He was wearing faded blue jeans, a plain gray t-shirt with a small hole near the collar, and a pair of scuffed, dusty work boots. He looked to be in his late 30s, with a strong jawline covered in a few days of stubble, and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He held his left hand wrapped in a stained rag, and a thin trickle of blood was seeping through. He didn't push to the front or demand attention. He simply walked to the reception desk and waited patiently for the frantic receptionist to acknowledge him. When she finally did, he spoke in a low, calm voice. "Hello. I had an accident in my workshop. I think I need a few stitches." He was given a clipboard and told to wait. He found a small patch of wall to lean against and filled out the paperwork without a word of complaint. Amara noticed him as she moved through the waiting room, while others sighed and tapped their feet and glared at the clock. He just stood there, perfectly still, his breathing even. There was a quiet solidity to him that was unusual. An hour and a half later, it was his turn. Amara called his name. Elias. He followed her into one of the small examination rooms. "Sorry for the wait," she said, her voice gentle. "It's no problem," he replied, his voice a surprisingly deep, smooth baritone. "You're all doing your best. It's busy today." She unwrapped the rag from his hand. It was a deep, clean gash on his palm, about 3 inches long. It was bleeding sluggishly. "Workshop accident?" she asked, her hands already moving, cleaning the wound with an expert touch. "Yes. A piece of wood kicked back from a table saw. Stupid mistake. I should have known better." "It happens," she said, preparing a suture kit. "I'm Amara. I'll be stitching you up. I need to numb the area first. You'll feel a small pinch." "Elias," he said. "Thank you, Amara." As she worked, they fell into a comfortable silence. He didn't flinch when she administered the local anesthetic. He watched her hands as she worked, her movements precise and confident. He noticed the way she concentrated, her brow furrowed slightly. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but also the deep well of competence in her touch. She wasn't just closing a wound, she was mending something. She treated his hand with a reverence that startled him. "You're very good at this," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you. I've had a lot of practice." "It's more than practice," he said. "You care." She finished the last stitch and began to bandage his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and a strange, unexpected warmth passed between them. It was nothing, and it was everything. She finished the dressing and gave him instructions for how to care for it. "Keep it clean and dry. The stitches will need to come out in about 10 days. "I will," he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment too long. "Thank you again, Amara." He walked out to the reception desk to pay. Amara went back to her charting, the brief moment of connection already fading under the relentless pressure of the day. A few minutes later, she heard a raised voice. It was Brenda. "What do you mean you don't have your wallet?" Brenda's voice was sharp, dripping with suspicion. "I'm sorry," she heard Elias's calm voice reply. "I was in a rush to get here after I cut myself. I must have left it at my workshop. I can come back with it first thing in the morning." "Oh, I'm sure you will," Brenda sneered, her voice loud enough for the whole waiting room to hear. "That's what they all say. We're not a charity, sir. The bill is $185.50. Payment is due at the time of service." Amara felt a flush of shame for Brenda's cruelty. She could feel the man's humiliation from across the room. She saw him standing there, his shoulders slumped slightly, the fresh white bandage on his hand a stark contrast to his worn clothes. "I can leave my driver's license," Elias offered. "My watch, even. It's not worth much, but it's all I have on me." "We don't take collateral," Brenda snapped. "Either you pay, or I'm calling security to escort you out, and we'll be sending your bill to collections." Something inside Amara broke. It was the injustice of it, the casual cruelty. She thought of her mother's words. The hand that gives, gathers. She walked over to the desk, her heart pounding. Her bank account was perilously low. She had just paid her rent, and the wire to her mother had gone through that morning. After this, she would have barely enough for groceries for the next 2 weeks. She stepped between Brenda and Elias. She didn't look at Elias. She kept her eyes on Brenda's furious face. "It's okay, Brenda," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll cover it." Brenda's eyes widened. "You'll what? Amara, are you insane? You can't just pay for every stray that wanders in here." "I'll cover it," Amara repeated. She took out her debit card, the plastic worn and faded, and handed it to the receptionist. "Please, just charge it to my card." The receptionist looked at Brenda, who gave a furious, exasperated sigh. "Fine. It's your money you're throwing away." The transaction went through. $185.50. A fortune. Amara felt a wave of dizziness as she thought about what that meant for her budget. But it was followed by a strange sense of peace. She had done the right thing. She turned to Elias. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. There was shock in his eyes, but something else too. Something deeper. You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's okay," she said, giving him a small, tired smile. "Just be more careful with that hand." She started to walk away, but he stepped in front of her. "No, it's not okay. I will pay you back. I insist. What's your full name? When do you work next?" She shook her head. "Don't worry about it. It's just money." "It's not just money," he said, his voice intense. "My name is Elias Corenting. Please, tell me your name." "Amara," she said softly. "Just Amara." "Amara," he repeated, the name a vow on his lips. "I won't forget this." He turned and walked out of the clinic, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. Brenda was glaring at Amara, her face a mask of rage. "I'm writing you up for this, Nwosu. Unprofessional conduct." Amara didn't care. She walked back to her station, her legs feeling a little weak. She didn't know it then, but with that single act of kindness, that $185.50 act of faith, she had just completely and irrevocably changed the course of her life. She had cast a stone into the water, and the ripples were about to become a tidal wave. The next day, Amara was certain she would never see Elias again. She'd replayed the scene in her head a dozen times, the feeling of financial panic warring with the quiet certainty that she'd done the right thing. She expected a write-up from Brenda on her desk, but surprisingly, there was nothing. Brenda just shot her venomous looks all morning. Fatima, her work friend, had heard the story through the clinic grapevine. "You paid his bill?" Fatima asked, her eyes wide as she cornered Amara in the break room. $185? Amara, you are either a saint or a fool, and I am not sure which. "He seemed like he was in trouble," Amara said, sipping her lukewarm coffee. "They all seem like they're in trouble," Fatima countered, stirring 3 sugars into her own cup. "Men are born looking like they're in trouble. It's how they get you. You'll never see that money again, my friend." Amara just shrugged. "Then I won't. It's done." But Fatima was wrong. Around lunchtime, just as Amara was about to eat her meager meal of a hard-boiled egg and a handful of nuts, the receptionist poked her head into the break room. "Amara? Someone's here to see you." Amara's heart did a strange little flip. She walked out to the waiting room, and there he was, Elias. He was wearing a similar outfit to the day before, jeans and a t-shirt, but today they looked clean, and his boots were less dusty. He was holding a small, simple bouquet of wildflowers, daisies and black-eyed Susans, and a plastic bag that smelled gloriously of home. He smiled when he saw her, a real smile this time, one that reached his dark eyes and transformed his severe face into something warm and approachable. "Amara," he said. "Elias, you came back." "I told you I would," he said. He held out an envelope. "Here, this is what I owe you." Inside, she would later find exactly $185.50 in crisp bills. "And this," he said, holding out the flowers, "is a down payment on my gratitude." She took the flowers, her cheeks flushing. They were beautiful, simple, and unpretentious. "You really didn't have to." "And this," he said, lifting the plastic bag, "is lunch. I hope you like jollof rice and fried plantain." Amara stared at him, truly speechless for the first time. Not just that he had brought her food, but that specific food. The scent of it was the scent of her mother's kitchen, of celebrations, of comfort. How did you know?" He shrugged, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Your accent. I guessed you might be Nigerian. I found a place not too far from here. The woman who runs it, Mrs. Adebayo, she assured me it was the best in the city. I brought enough for two." It was the most thoughtful gesture anyone had ever made for her, more thoughtful than any of the expensive, impersonal gifts David had ever bought her. David had seen her heritage as a flaw to be smoothed over. This man, this stranger, had seen it as a clue to her heart. They ate lunch together in the dingy break room, sitting on cracked vinyl chairs under the flickering fluorescent light. They ate out of the styrofoam containers he'd brought, sharing the food between them. For the first time, Amara felt herself relax. He asked her questions about her life, about Nigeria, about her family. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. He didn't talk much about himself, only saying that his workshop was downtown and that he liked working with his hands. He said he built things. It was vague, but she didn't press. He started visiting her regularly after that. He would show up once or twice a week, always during her lunch break. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was coffee, sometimes a pastry, sometimes another container of jollof rice from Mrs. Adebayo's. He became a quiet, steady presence in her chaotic life. Her colleagues noticed. Brenda watched their interactions with a narrowed, suspicious gaze. Fatima revised her opinion. "Okay, so he's not a complete deadbeat," she conceded one afternoon, watching Elias and Amara talking in a corner of the waiting room. "But he's still hiding something. Men that quiet are either poets or serial killers. Let's hope for your sake he's a poet." Amara just laughed. She was starting to feel things she hadn't felt in a long time. A lightness in her chest. A genuine smile that wasn't forced. She was falling, not for a fantasy, but for the man himself. For his kindness. For the way he remembered small details she told him weeks ago, like her sister's favorite author, or the type of tea her mother drank. For the way he looked at her, with a mixture of respect and a deep, unnerving tenderness. One rainy afternoon, he was waiting for her after her shift ended. He was leaning against his truck, an old, slightly beat-up Toyota Tacoma. It was a working man's truck, the bed scratched and dented. It was so different from David's pristine, leased BMW that the contrast made her smile. "I thought you might need a ride," he said, holding an umbrella over her head. "I usually take the bus," she said. "I know," he replied, "but it's raining." On the drive to her apartment, he was quiet. The rain drummed on the roof of the truck. "Amara," he said suddenly, his voice serious. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "What would you do if you had all the money in the world? I mean, a ridiculous amount, more than you could ever spend." It was a strange question, a fantasy game. She thought about it seriously. David would have had an answer ready, A yacht, a penthouse, a collection of Swiss watches. Amara's answer was different. It came from the deepest part of her.
First, she said, her voice soft, I would pay off my sister's university fees, all at once, so she wouldn't have to worry. Then, I would buy my mother a new house in our village, with a proper roof that doesn't leak and a big garden for her vegetables. I'd hire a driver to take her to her doctor's appointments. She paused, looking out at the rain-streaked streets. And then, she continued, I would go back to her village, and I would build a clinic. A small one, but clean and modern. It would be free for everyone. The elders there, they have to travel for hours to see a doctor. Many of them, they just don't go. I would want them to have a place where they could be cared for with dignity. She finished, feeling a little embarrassed, as if she'd revealed too much of herself. She glanced at Elias. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at her, his expression one of profound, heart-stopping emotion. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and briefly, gently, squeezed her hand. In that moment, he wasn't just holding her hand. He was holding her dreams. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had found her. The woman he had stopped believing existed. But he wasn't ready to tell her yet. The test was over, but the reveal was yet to come, and it had to be perfect. Their relationship deepened over the next few months. The lunch dates in the break room turned into weekend walks in the park and quiet dinners at small, unassuming restaurants he always seemed to find. He never took her anywhere fancy. He seemed to prefer simple pleasures, a shared pizza, a walk by the river, browsing in a dusty old bookstore. Amara had never been happier. She was falling in love with this kind, quiet, mysterious man who built things. She told her mother about him. He has kind eyes, Mama, she said over the phone one Sunday. And he listens. He really listens. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Kindness is the guest that is always welcome, she said. But a man is like a river, my daughter. The surface can be calm, while the current below is strong and deep. Be sure you know the depth of his heart before you let him carry you away. Amara thought about her mother's words. She realized she knew very little about Elias's life outside of the time they spent together. He never talked about his family. His past was a closed book. The vagueness that had once been charming was now starting to feel like a wall between them. Finally, one cool evening in early autumn, she decided to ask. They were sitting on a park bench, watching the leaves fall. Elias, she began, her heart thumping, I feel like I know you, but I also don't know you at all. You say you build things, but what does that mean? Where's your family? What was your life like before you met me? He looked at her, his face serious in the fading light. He took a deep breath. You're right, he said. It's not fair to you. I've been careful. I have things I need to tell you, Amara. Things I need to show you, but I can't do it here. He stood up and pulled her to her feet. Will you have dinner with me tomorrow night? A real dinner, not pizza. Let me pick you up at 7, and please, just trust me. The next evening, Amara dressed with care. She wore a simple black dress, one of the few nice things she owned. She felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. At exactly 7, she heard a vehicle pull up. She looked out her window, expecting to see his old Toyota Tacoma, but it wasn't there. Instead, a sleek, black Audi A8 was parked at the curb. Elias got out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a dark,
well-fitted blazer, a crisp white shirt, and dark trousers. He looked different, polished, expensive. He saw her looking from the window and gave a small, nervous smile. When she came downstairs, he opened the car door for her. The interior smelled of new leather. "You got a new car," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It's complicated," he said, and started the engine. He didn't drive towards the city's restaurant district. Instead, he headed for the outskirts, towards the small municipal airport. Amara's confusion grew with every mile. He finally pulled up to a private gate, which slid open silently as they approached. He drove onto the tarmac, towards a row of private jets. He stopped beside a gleaming white Gulfstream G650, its engines whining softly. "Elias, what is this?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The scale of the plane, the sheer, blatant wealth of it, was dizzying. He turned to her, his face pale. He looked more nervous than she had ever seen him. "I told you I needed to show you something," he said. "This is part of it. Please, Amara, just a little further. Trust me." She got out of the car, her legs feeling like they didn't belong to her. A flight attendant in a sharp uniform greeted them at the base of the stairs. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Corenting." Mr. Corenting. The name echoed in her mind. He led her up the stairs and into the cabin. It wasn't like a plane. It was like a luxury apartment, with cream-colored leather seats, polished wood paneling, and soft, indirect lighting. It was silent and opulent and terrifying. They sat in a pair of large armchairs. The flight attendant offered them champagne. Elias politely declined for both of them. The plane began to move, accelerating down the runway with a powerful, seamless thrust. Amara watched her city shrink below, the grid of lights becoming a sparkling carpet. She felt completely unmoored, adrift in a reality she didn't understand. They flew in silence for about an hour, heading north along the coast. Finally, the plane began its descent. Below them, nestled in a cove and surrounded by a dark forest of pine trees, was a sprawling estate. It wasn't a gaudy mansion, but a magnificent modern structure of glass and cedar and stone that seemed to grow out of the landscape itself. It was surrounded by meticulously landscaped gardens and a path that led down to a private beach. The plane landed on a private airstrip. A black Range Rover was waiting to take them the short distance to the house. The front doors, massive panels of wood and glass, swung open as they approached. The interior was breathtaking. A 2-story living room with a wall of glass looked out over the Pacific Ocean. The furniture was minimalist and elegant. The art on the walls was original, modern, and museum quality. Amara stood in the middle of the room, feeling small and utterly out of place. "Elias," she whispered, turning to him. "Whose house is this?" He finally met her eyes. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching vulnerability. "It's my house, Amara." He took her hand and led her to a sofa. "Please, sit down. Let me explain." He took a deep breath. "My name is Elias Corenting. My father was an immigrant from Ghana. He started a small construction company. He was a good man. He worked hard. When he died, he left it to me. It was small, but it was solid. I was good with computers, with systems. I started to see how technology could change construction, logistics, infrastructure. I took the company and I built things. It grew, faster and bigger than I ever imagined." He looked away, out at the ocean. "Today, Corenting Industries is a global technology infrastructure company. We have projects in 40 countries. We build the invisible networks that the modern world runs on. Data centers, fiber optic networks, logistics hubs." He paused, then said the words that shattered her reality. "My personal net worth is around $3.7 billion. The number was so large it was meaningless. Amara's mind couldn't grasp it. She just stared at him. The man who ate jollof rice with her in a grimy break room. The man who drove a beat-up truck. The man whose bill she had paid, $185.50. The absurdity of it was so immense, a hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. "A billionaire?" she said, the word sounding ridiculous. "You? A billionaire in those old work boots?" He looked down at his feet, now clad in expensive Italian leather loafers. "The boots are more comfortable," he said with a small, sad smile. The humor faded, replaced by a wave of crushing shock and a sharp, painful question. This whole time, it had been a lie, a game. She felt her heart closing up, the old walls from the David era going up, brick by brick. "Why?" she asked, her voice cold. "Why lie to me? Was this some kind of game? A rich man's experiment to see how the other half lives?" "No," he said, his voice urgent, pained. He moved closer, taking her hands. They were trembling. "No, Amara, never. Please, you have to let me explain." He told her about his past, about a woman he had been engaged to, a beautiful socialite from a prominent family. He had been deeply in love. He thought she loved him. But as the wedding approached, the talk turned to prenuptial agreements. Her lawyers and his lawyers went to war, and in one of a brutal meeting, her mask had slipped. She'd screamed at him that she wasn't going to be cheated out of the lifestyle she deserved. He realized in that horrifying moment that she had never seen him. She had only ever seen his bank account. He was just a walking, talking ATM. "I ended it," he said, his voice raw. "And I promised myself I would never make that mistake again. I was so tired of people who looked at me but only saw money. People who laughed at my jokes because they thought they were supposed to. People whose love was a transaction. So I retreated. I bought the old truck. I kept the workshop my father started. It's the only place I feel like myself. I started to live a simpler life, hoping I could find someone who would see me. Just me. Elias the builder, not Elias the billionaire." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "And then I walked into your clinic. I'd cut my hand. I'd forgotten my wallet for real, and I was embarrassed. And that manager, she was exactly the kind of person I had come to expect. Judgmental, cruel, seeing only surfaces. And then you stepped in." He squeezed her hands. "Amara, you didn't just pay a bill. You had no idea who I was. You were tired. You were stressed. And I know now that you barely had any money yourself. That $185 was a sacrifice. You looked at a stranger in dusty boots, a man who could do absolutely nothing for you, and you showed him a kindness so pure it took my breath away. You didn't do it for a reward. You did it because it's who you are." Tears were welling in his eyes. "In that moment, you became the richest person I had ever met. Your character, your compassion, that is true wealth. Everything else," he said, gesturing around the magnificent room, "this is just paper. It's just noise." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own wallet, a worn leather thing. From it, he took out a folded, slightly crumpled receipt. The receipt from the clinic. For $185.50. "I've carried this with me every day since," he said, "to remind me what is real." The walls around Amara's heart didn't just crumble. They evaporated. The tears she had been holding back began to fall, silent and hot, down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because of the money, or the house, or the plane. She was crying because for the first time since her mother had held her as a child, she felt completely and utterly seen. He hadn't just seen her kindness. He had seen her exhaustion, her sacrifice, her quiet strength. He had seen all the broken, tired, and resilient parts of her and called them beautiful. "Why me?" she whispered through her tears. "Because you're real," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In a world of fake, you are the realest thing I have ever known. You didn't fall in love with a billionaire, Amara. You fell in love with a man in an old truck who brought you lunch. And I didn't fall in love with a pretty nurse. I fell in love with a queen who was hiding in plain sight, wearing scrubs as a disguise." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I love you, Amara Nwosu, and I'm done hiding." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Elias insisted on keeping his identity a secret from the world for a little while longer, to give them time. Time for Amara to adjust. Time for them to just be a couple. But everything was different. He paid off the $7,450 debt from David with a single, dismissive phone call, an act that lifted a weight Amara hadn't even realized was still crushing her. He set up a trust that paid her sister's tuition and all her living expenses, with enough left over to ensure she could start her career debt-free. He flew a team of the best architects and builders to Nigeria to construct a new home for her mother, complete with a solar-powered well in the garden she had always dreamed of. Amara struggled with the sheer scale of his generosity. "It's too much," she would say, overwhelmed. "It's nothing," he would reply, kissing her forehead. "It's just paper. The only thing that's not too much is you." She continued to work at the clinic. It was her anchor, her connection to the person she had always been. Showing up for her shifts, putting on her scrubs, caring for her patients. It kept her grounded in a world that had tilted on its axis. Brenda was still Brenda, sharp-tongued and resentful. She was deeply suspicious of the expensive car that now dropped Amara off and picked her up, but she couldn't figure it out. Amara, for her part, treated Brenda with the same quiet professionalism as always, a fact that seemed to infuriate the manager even more. Then came the news. The parent company, a massive healthcare conglomerate called WellSource, had been quietly selling off its least profitable assets. Hopewell Community Clinic was at the top of the list. The building had been sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build luxury condos. The clinic would be closed in 30 days. All staff would be terminated. The announcement was devastating. For the staff, it was the loss of their jobs. But for the community, it was a catastrophe. Hopewell was the only affordable healthcare option for thousands of people. Its closure was a death sentence for some. The mood in the clinic turned funereal. The usual hustle and bustle was replaced by a heavy, defeated quiet. Nurses who had worked there for decades cried openly at their stations. Amara felt a deep, personal grief. The clinic was more than a job. It was her calling. She told Elias the news, her voice breaking. He held her, his face grim. "They can't do that," he said, a hard edge to his voice she had never heard before. "This is your place. This is where I found you." He held her tight and said, "Don't worry. I won't let it happen." She didn't understand what he could possibly do, but she trusted him. WellSource called a final, mandatory all-staff meeting. It was to be held in the clinic's waiting room, a final indignity. The corporate executives would be there to explain the transition
and offer meaningless platitudes.
The day of the meeting arrived, gray and overcast. The staff gathered, their faces grim. Brenda was there, dressed in a severe black suit, trying to look important, but just looking scared. Amara stood with Fatima, holding her friend's hand. A slick executive named Mr. Harris began to speak, his voice smooth and insincere. He talked about market forces, shareholder value, and strategic realignment. He used every corporate buzzword imaginable to say one simple thing: you are not profitable enough to exist. And then the cars arrived. The silence fell like a hammer. 4 black Rolls-Royce Cullinans, the bodyguards. And then Elias, emerging like a king from a chariot. He was wearing the charcoal Tom Ford suit, an armor of wealth and power. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She knew this was it. The end of the quiet part. The beginning of the loud. He walked into the clinic, and the world stopped. Mr. Harris trailed off, his mouth agape. Brenda's face went from confusion to shock to a dawning, sickening horror as she recognized the man from the dusty boots, the man whose bill she had tried to send to collections. Elias ignored them all. His eyes found Amara. He walked through the stunned crowd, a path parting before him as if by magic. He stopped in front of her, his expression softening as he looked at her in her simple scrubs. The whole room, the whole world, was holding its breath. He turned to face the dumbfounded executives. His voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Harris, you can stop talking now." He then addressed the entire room. "My name is Elias Korantang. As of 9 o'clock this morning, my company completed the acquisition of WellSource Health. I am the new owner." A collective gasp swept through the room. It was a sound of 150 minds trying to reboot at once. Doctors, nurses, even Brenda stared at him in utter disbelief. He was the owner? The whole conglomerate? "This clinic will not be closing," Elias announced, his voice ringing with conviction. A wave of stunned, joyful murmurs rippled through the staff. Tears of grief turned into tears of shock and relief. "It will be expanding," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I am personally funding the construction of a new, state-of-the-art wing, doubling its capacity. We will have the best equipment, the best supplies, and we will be hiring more staff at higher salaries." The room erupted in cheers, a raw, emotional explosion of joy. Fatima was screaming and hugging Amara, who was just standing there, her own tears flowing freely, her hand over her mouth. Elias held up a hand, and the room fell silent again, waiting. "The clinic will also be getting a new name." He turned back to Amara, his eyes locking with hers. The love in them was so powerful, it was a physical force. The entire room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them. "It will be called the Amara Nwosu Center for Compassionate Care," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The silence that followed was the most profound of all. It was a silence of awe, of reverence, and in that perfect, holy silence, Elias Korantang, one of the wealthiest men in the world, got down on one knee on the worn linoleum floor of the Hopewell Community Clinic, in front of the woman he loved. He opened the small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a magnificent diamond, flawless and brilliant, that seemed to shine with its own inner light. "The jeweler told me this stone is priceless," he said, his voice for her alone now. "But he's wrong. The most priceless thing in my life is the kindness you showed a stranger. Compassion is the only currency that truly matters." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "Amara Nwosu, you saw my heart when no one else could. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything? Will you run the new global charitable foundation I am launching and teach the world what you taught me about what it means to be truly wealthy? He took her hand. The ring is new, but I had something engraved on the inside. Amara, crying too hard to speak, could only nod. A sob of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her lips. Yes. The answer was yes. The clinic erupted into a deafening roar of applause and cheers. Elias slid the ring onto her finger. She would look later and see the tiny, perfect inscription on the inside of the band. For my $185.50. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The story became a local legend, then a national phenomenon. The Nurse and the Billionaire. It was a modern fairy tale, but for the people at the clinic, it was real. Brenda was not fired. The day after the proposal, Amara, in her new, unofficial capacity as the future head of the foundation and the clinic's namesake, called Brenda into her office, the office that had once been Brenda's. The manager entered, pale and trembling, expecting to be dismissed. She looked smaller, stripped of her petty power.
"Brenda," Amara said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm not going to fire you."
Brenda looked up, shocked. "I believe everyone deserves a chance to learn and to grow. You will remain here, but in a new role. You'll be in charge of procurement and inventory. Your job will be to make sure this clinic never runs out of a single bandage or alcohol swab ever again. You will report to Fatima, who is the new head nurse." It was a punishment more elegantly devised than any termination. Brenda had to stay and watch the woman she had tormented lead with grace. She had to take orders from the woman she had once condescended to. She had to witness, every day, the power of a kindness she had never understood. And in time, something in her began to change. The bitterness began to chip away, replaced by a grudging respect, and eventually, a quiet understanding. David, the ex-boyfriend, heard the news, of course. The story was everywhere.
He saw the pictures of Amara, radiant, on the arm of a man whose wealth was beyond his wildest, most pathetic fantasies. He sent her a text, a desperate, cloying message. "I saw the news. I always knew you were special, Amara. I made a terrible mistake. I miss you." Amara read the message, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to her. She felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even pity. Just nothing. He was a stranger. She deleted the text without replying and blocked his number. He was later spotted by a journalist, trying to talk his way into their engagement party, claiming to be an old friend. He was politely, but firmly, turned away by a bodyguard who didn't even bother to look him in the eye. Amara's family was flown in from Nigeria on Elias's jet. The reunion at the airport was a flood of happy tears. Her mother, Idia, stepped onto American soil for the first time, looking around in wonder. When she finally met Elias, she didn't look at his clothes or his watch. She just took his hands in her own, her palms rough from a lifetime of work. She looked into his eyes for a long, silent moment. Then she nodded, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. "You have a good heart," she said in Igbo. "You see my daughter." Then she looked at Amara, her eyes shining with pride. "The hand that gives, gathers," she whispered. "It gathers everything." The wedding was an event, but it was their event. It was held at the estate, overlooking the ocean. It was grand, but not gaudy. The guest list was a mix of global leaders and the entire staff of the Amara Nwosu Center for Compassionate Care, who were all flown in and put up in luxury hotels.
The catering featured a 5-star menu, but also a sprawling, magnificent jollof rice station, presided over by none other than Mrs. Adebayo, who Elias had hired as a permanent culinary consultant for his foundation's events. Amara's dress was a custom Oscar de la Renta, but it was designed from a sketch she had drawn herself, a pattern inspired by traditional Nigerian embroidery. Fatima was her maid of honor. Her toast was the highlight of the evening. She stood before the glittering crowd, raised her glass of champagne, and said, "I have known Amara for 10 years. I have seen her work until she was ready to drop. I have seen her give her lunch to a stranger when it was the only food she had. And when this man," she said, pointing at Elias with her glass, "showed up looking like he just wrestled a tractor, I told her he was trouble. I told her he was hiding something." She paused, a grin spreading across her face. "And I was right. He was hiding something. I'm just glad it was $3.7 billion and not a secret second family in another state." The room roared with laughter. "To Amara and Elias," she finished, her voice full of love, "may you always be richer in kindness than you are in cash." The Amara Nwosu Center for Compassionate Care flourished. It became a model for community health care across the nation, and the foundation, under Amara's leadership, began its work, building free clinics in impoverished communities around the world, starting with a beautiful new facility in her mother's village in Nigeria. Amara had found her calling, not just as a nurse, but as a global force for good. She was still the same woman, kind, humble, and hardworking, but now, the hand that gave had the power to gather up the entire world in its embrace. True wealth is not in the wallet you carry, but in the heart you reveal when that wallet is empty. It is measured not by what you can buy, but by what you are willing to give when you have almost nothing left. A designer suit can be bought, a luxury car can be leased, but character, true character, can only be forged in the fires of hardship and polished by the practice of compassion. Kindness is a currency that never devalues, an investment that always pays dividends. And the hand that gives, no matter how empty it may seem, will always, always gather. If this story moved your heart, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every tale has a lesson, and Alfred's Folk Tales never forgets.